I previously made this video on how to take your Illustrator or PDF patterns and import them into CLO so you can virtually sew them and drape them on your avatar. Recently, I got this question in the comments. How do I go about a pattern that already includes seam allowance? And it was really crazy that this person asked this question because I was in the process of making today's video that demonstrates exactly how to do this. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Mikkel Drew Pelham. I talk about digital fashion design tools, how to communicate your ideas clearly, and how to turn creativity into a sustainable fashion business. If you're tired of guessing what fashion software to use, what skills to learn, and what actually matters as you build your brand, this channel is for you. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you can keep learning with me. To give this question a bit more context, if you're using an existing home sewing pattern, or perhaps you have a pattern that you created in Illustrator and added seam allowance, you'll need to remove it before you use it in CLO3D. Now, this is actually a step I missed in that last video because I forgot that most patterns already have the 1/2 or 5/8 inch seam allowance included in the pattern. But what you may not know is that in CLO, the patterns you're working with do not include seam allowance. Now, when you're working with DXF patterns, which usually are output by 2D CAD systems, you have the option to swap the outline and the sew line when you import the pattern. What that means is that CLO will automatically remove the seam allowance so that you can properly work with the pattern in the software. But when you're dealing with patterns you've created in Illustrator or patterns you bought online or you scanned, when you import it, there's no option to swap the cutting and sewing lines. So when the pattern is opened, it still contains the seam allowance. And you'll need to remove it in order for the pattern to look correct when it's virtually sewn and draped on your avatar. So here's how you do it, and a quick shout out to IDE Studio for schooling me on this feature. I'm going to use the same pattern I used in my previous video. And if you're taking my course, this is something you'll want to do before you proceed with the rest of the exercise. When you look at the finished file, you'll notice it's a bit big on the avatar. Now, for my purposes, it really wasn't that big of a deal. It's just a practice exercise for virtual sewing. But what I realized is that if I'd remembered to remove the seam allowance, this would have fit a lot better. So let's do that now. You're going to use a function called offset pattern outline. And for my Illustrator users, this is the equivalent to offset path, which you might be using already if you're currently making your patterns in Illustrator. Now, it's possible to just select all of your patterns and offset all of your seam lines at once. However, more than likely, you're not going to have the same seam allowance on all parts of your pattern. In particular, the hem of your pattern is normally wider than the rest of the pattern outlines. So instead, I'm going to use the transform pattern tool, which is like the white arrow in Illustrator. And like the white arrow, you're going to select specific parts of your pattern or patterns that will have the same seam allowance width. So for this hoodie, I'm going to marquee around the sleeve first. And notice there are areas that don't select with just the marquee, because if I select enough of it to get the rest of the underseam, I'll also select the hem, which I don't want to do. So for those parts of the underseam, and you'll see this too once you get to the side seams, you'll press and hold Shift and then click directly on that segment of the pattern outline. Continue holding the Shift key and marquee around the front and back patterns, clicking directly on the side seams as necessary. And since the sleeves have symmetric editing, the correct parts of the pattern outline should already be selected for the opposite sleeve. Lastly, I'll marquee around the hood, purposely not selecting the hood hem. Next, position the cursor over any highlighted line, right mouse click, and choose Offset Pattern Outline. And keep in mind that I specifically mentioned positioning the cursor over a highlighted line. Make sure you do that because if you click on the canvas, you won't see the correct menu. There's a number of options here, but the two you'll change are direction and distance. The first thing you'll do is change direction to retract. That's going to move your pattern outlines inward, essentially making the pattern a little smaller, as opposed to using the default, which is extend, which will make the pattern bigger. For distance, you'll type in the seam allowance so that it retracts and removes that much of the pattern. Most home sewing pattern seam allowances are either 1/2 inch or 5/8 of an inch, but make sure you check that on your pattern so it doesn't get too small or stay a little too big. Once you hit OK, you'll notice there are purple dotted lines around your pattern outlines that you retracted. These are your baselines, and they're really only there at this point to show you where your old cut line or where the seam allowance once was. Now, if you're not seeing them, you can click on the garment display icon. It looks like a little t-shirt, and choose Show Baselines. Also, if you're seeing your baselines and you don't want to, you can click that same option to hide them. For the hems, you'll do exactly the same thing. This time, just click directly on the hemline. Again, right mouse click and choose Offset Pattern Outline. Retract should still be selected, and this time you'll just update the distance to the hem height. Now, normally you'd also do this for the hood hem. Interestingly enough, I actually remembered to remove the hem on the hood, but for your pattern, you'd still need to go through the steps to remove it. What's also great about this method is that all the sewing is still there. So for those of you who are doing this on a garment you've already sewn in CLO and just forgot to remove the seam allowances, you can just hit the space bar to simulate, and the updated garment should look like it fits much better. I'm kind of glad that I made this error because it gave me a chance to demonstrate how important something like just having an extra 1/2 inch seam allowance can affect the fit of your garment. This is what it looked like when we started, and this is what it looks like now. Yes, there are still some fit issues, but the new one without the extra seam allowance fits much better. It's neater, and it actually looks like it's her size as opposed to something that not only has fit issues, but it's also too big. So if you are bringing your patterns into CLO, whether they're patterns you've created or patterns you bought online, make sure you remember to remove the seam allowance before you start working with them. Otherwise, it'll completely throw off the fit of your garment. Thanks for watching this week's video. If you are interested in starting your own 3D journey, make sure you check out my CLO3D course. It'll take you through the basics of using the program and how you use it as a designer. You also now have the option of either choosing a one-time purchase of the course or joining our membership, which gives you not only access to the course, but also access to our budding community of independent designers, plus additional design resources for one monthly price. So if you'd like more information or you're ready to sign up, make sure you click the link in the description. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video with another designer who needs to hear it. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you next time.